You have been an observer of gurus, political and otherwise. And like you said, a bunch of them have rose to prominence in the Trump administration or incoming Trump administration. But what people in our Patreon were wondering, who are the movers and shakers that you predict for next year? So when we come back next year, we can say, you said that this person would be like a guru to watch, but actually they have fallen into oblivion and they're no longer relevant, or they become like the prime minister or president or whatever the case might be. So this is a question for both of you. I have my ideas too, but who's going to like ascend in the guru echelons? Anybody you have your eyes on?
There's lots of people. I actually gave myself some credit. I wrote a long piece about Joe Rogan in April, and I went to Austin and I watched him do stand-up and I watched the supporting acts. And Tony Hinchcliffe, later to become famous from the Madison Square Garden rally where he was rude about Puerto Rico, was one of the support acts. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, everybody is acting like, oh my God, it's Tony Hinchcliffe. You know, he's got that aura about Tony. Him that everybody's kind of, and Kill Tony, his podcast is massive. So I think in terms of influence, I think there's an issue with Rogan, which is I think almost Rogan has entered his sort of late imperial phase, right? He feels very much like Rome, sort of like Rome post Julius Caesar now, right? He's still incredibly powerful, but you sort of think, I'm hearing rumblings from Germany. And so, obviously he can sustain that, but actually Tucker Carlson is sort of nipping at his heels in terms of taking that number one spot on Spotify, which I think would be really interesting. But anyway, so my predictions, of all the kind of guru sort of comedy people, the one I was most impressed by was Theo Von, whose interview with Trump was actually genuinely very revealing of his psychology, particularly the terrible effect of having a alcoholic older brother who died from that disease. And it's one of the things that's rarely mentioned about Trump is that he doesn't drink, right? And he hates people who do get drunk. I think it's about behind a lot of his kind of germ phobia and that kind of sort of stuff is having watched his brother succumb to this really unpleasant illness and having had a father who was deeply unsympathetic about it has shaped his psyche a lot. So, for all that I was very rude about lots of those podcast streamer interviews that Trump did, like the Lex Fridman one was just abysmal. The Logan Paul one was objectively very boring, but the Theo Von was genuinely insightful. So I wouldn't be surprised if he does a lot better. I don't know if he wants to become explicitly political in the way that I think Rogan has now turned to being a political podcaster, refusing to have Zelensky on. Like he actually just doesn't want to be challenged now and have like a loose, unstructured chat, right? He wants to stay in his safe space. So I think David Walliams, who might not be a name that's familiar to people, but David Walliams was in a comedy called Little Britain. He's a very successful children's author here, but he has been dogged for a long time by these slightly, what's he like to work with? Like, why did he got sacked from Britain's Got Talent for having said rude things about the contestants? He's come off doing a little tour with Josh Zepps, who was a smart eye for the next kind of polemicist. And I think if Williams gets any more cancelled, then for him, those mainstream opportunities are going to close. And he is a charismatic narcissist. The obvious place for him would be to end up somewhere like Rumble. So I've got my eye on him. I've also got my eye on the trigonometry lads, who I know are faves of yours, because by God are they ambitious. Right, but they were Rogan's guest, the one after Elon Musk, right? Immediately after the election, right? They want it so bad. And so I think, they've got the drive that is required to just force themselves into that IDW sphere.
It's so funny.
Why haven't you got that drive, Chris? Why are you not hanging out with these people?
Well, one, I think you're right. The dark horse is Francis. He will rise through the ashes of the bodies of his fallen enemies and ascend the guru throne. He'll be there at the end. No, but come on, like
Konstantin has had like a proper Hollywood makeover, right? Like he wants to be on TV. He's had the work done. He's done the work and had the work.
There was the profile of him in the New Statesman a while back as well, and various critical coverage of Konstantin, and he was very prickly about it, right? To be fair, the New Statesman, I think, called him like a fish-eyed ghoul or something, but in any case, like he had a very thin skin response and was like, when we covered his speech at the Oxford Union, right? He did this episode that was like extremely revealing because he basically presented it as this is the crowning achievement of his career, his life, his intellectual output was this 10-minute speech, which we looked at and was just like, just completely rhetoric. It was red meat rhetoric for conservative, like kind of populist stuff. But it was really shallow. But he was, he said on the show, I could look my wife in the eye. People were calling me up saying, "You've made it to the big leagues," and it was all like.
Did it make you very snobby? Did you actually, some of us spoke at the Oxford Union, at the age of 19.
Did you speak there when you were 19?
Yeah, I thought they were all wankers, really. But I would have spoken in an adjournment debate or something, because why wouldn't you? Just for to sort of troll people. But I thought what was really interesting is that he's absolutely nailed the thing that gurudom and presenting yourself as being outside the mainstream media while having a huge platform allows you to do, which is to say everyone's against me, and when they're attacking me, they're attacking you, my audience.
Yeah.
So what you can do is just some fairly straightforward boasting. Can you imagine if I went out there and went, I don't know if you guys know, but I actually went to Oxford University. Yeah, I got a first class degree. I objectively am great. People would think I was the biggest tosser in the world, correctly so. But because of his outsider positioning, he's able to go, I spoke at the Oxford Union, I was amazing, it was amazing, and that means you were amazing. And he somehow nails the landing of saying, and isn't in a way, isn't it all of our triumphs? And it's not really. It's just you, really, just you. But yeah, so that's what I mean. He's super smart and he really wants it. So I think he'll get there.
So we find that kind of public crowing, it just doesn't. It's not very nice to watch. It's distasteful.
But Americans don't mind it. That's. I know you're Irish, but that's your British upbringing or Anglo upbringing speaking. Yeah.
So I was saying to Matt, essentially that even though yes, it was cringy and all that kind of thing, but Constantine was right, because he did get invited onto bigger shows. He did get onto mainstream talk shows as a pundit, and his profile did increase. So he was right that's all it took. A 10-minute viral video, and you're in the big league. So I think trigonometry is a good bet. And I think Francis is along for the ride, or maybe he's the puppet master behind it. I also think that Jimmy Carr, I don't know if he'll go into that, but he has pretensions of being a philosopher comedian. From what I've seen of his recent on podcasts.
But I also think it depends how much money. And I would say at the moment he could make much more money from touring stand-up comedy. And I think if you remember his tax affairs of a few years ago, he's very motivated by money, but he's also very motivated by one of his tours was called Joke Technician, and that is also the attitude he takes to his career as well, right? He again, like Constantine, he is very much. Not mercenary, because that sounds unnewly rude about him, but he will go where he thinks the money and attention is. And as I say, until he, has sex with a horse or whatever it might be, or accidentally says the N-word, he can be on Channel 4. He can do that, mate, and then he can turn that into a comedy career. So I know what you mean. He's been on Diary of a CEO, and there's a very funny TikTok, I think, taking the piss out of him, which is basically him on Diary of a CEO is just think in 15 years' time, you'll give anything you owned in order to be as young as you are now. And then the Jimmy Carver stand-up is you've got a smelly vagina. It's just there's just two completely disparate personas. And I guess, he can probably ride both of them at the same time. And I know what you mean. I think he only would do, I think, a guru pivot post-cancellation. And he's not at the moment cancelled, so he doesn't need to.
I think David Williams is a good bet as well. Matt, do you have anybody to add?
Well, we covered Sabine Hossenfelder recently, and that was just interesting. Not a major trend, but it is interesting because she is someone who genuinely produces a good educational content, can do, has a genuine background in theoretical physics, but just more and more is finding the YouTube algorithm and feeling the effect of that. And I just think, it's so interesting. Her tweets and her retweets of political things and conspiratorial things, anti-institutional things, just keep growing. And that theme is getting injected into more and more of her videos. And those are the videos that really do numbers, and this is 100% of where her income comes from. So I don't think that's a big deal, but I've seen, again, this who's that theory? Is it Theory of Everything? Who's the interviewer guy, Chris? Kurt
Jamungel. I don't know how his surname, but
he interviews complete cranks, right? He's had Eric Weinstein on, of course. He's also had this other guy who I forget his name, but he is the crankiest crank of physics crank you've ever heard of. He's the 200
IQ.
That's his line. Hey, he's got a 200 IQ.
The thing about that is that that's always a bit dodgy, because realistically, to get that high on an IQ test, it's one where you had to take it when you were like sort of 6 years old, and there's a ceiling on the test, right? And then you just say, well, if you manage to hit the ceiling at this particular age, that's how
you
we
don't
work
need to
back on it.
debunk. You don't need to debunk this claim.
Okay, sorry. Just putting it out there. I went and did an IQ test as part of reporting this book, and for all we think, Stephen Jay Gould, right, in the environmentalist critique of IQ, that it's all like IQ just measures what's going good at IQ tests. That was overdone, right? There is definitely a hereditary component to IQ. Nonetheless, these IQ tests are genuinely like the culture-dependent ones are embarrassing. One was a question about lions and savages in the year of our Lord 2024, and another one was predicated on the idea that all women took their husband's name on marriage, which I huffily refused to answer in a sort of feminist kind of but like it was a good insight into the fact that actually some of the critiques of IQ were correct, right? That it does to some extent measure, are you a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant familiar with the kind of culture of the 20th century? Anyway, not to sass this guy. I'm sure in his own way he's very clever and special.
Yeah. But anyway, so I think it's just interesting to see someone who kind of is or was respectable and can be respectable be drawn into that crowd of complete cranks and oddballs and conspiratorial weirdos. And it's like the cause is structural. You know what I mean? I don't think it's like, Sabine has a personality that, is a bit grouchy and all that stuff. But really, it's not about her. It's actually about, that's where the YouTube algorithm leads you. You think
you have to think of like these people often as being like plants growing towards the sun, right? I think that a lot about the kind of, all the pieces that got commissioned in the 2010s about, is girls racist, is, whatever. To some extent, were they genuinely held opinions? Were they opinions that did very well under the kind of conditions of the internet at the time? Yes. And so I'm sure, people have obviously like tendencies within them, but the cultural conditions bring them out. And in this case, I think the fact we all know that the YouTube algorithm rewards certain things has made a lot of people grow towards the sun in that way. Go on, Chris. You said you had another one.
I have 3, but they're all together, and they are just.
You two are so prolific.
They're quick fire. No, but this is partly your inspiration, Matt.
Good.
Ken Klippenstein, Taylor Lorenz, and Anna Kasparian.
So Anna Kasparian is doing a very interesting, I didn't lead the left left me thing, right?
Yes.
I thought I'm a liberal mugged by reality, so now I'm a conservative, and there's a massive market for that. Particularly as a woman, because there aren't enough women in that area. So I agree with you. Taylor Lorenz now freed from the shackles of having an employer and therefore able to, for example, think it's very funny that a CEO got assassinated because he's a US healthcare provider.
She's putting out like contract hits for Sky.
Right, but also, in the same thing that I've talked about Graham Linehan becoming worse when he got to Substack, that's also the same thing can happen to people on the left too, right? You say things that are edgier simply because you get rewarded by your fans. They see it as a mark of you being anti-establishment and an outsider, and there is no commercial downside to doing so. So yeah, I could see that. Ken Klippenstein, was he the one who got briefly banned from Twitter for something? Remind me about this. Leaking JD Vance's Oppo report about when he was going to be vice president, right? He leaked the opposition research on JD Vance that had his social security number in.
Yeah, and he's currently doing the Taylor Lorenz thing about finds it very funny that the CEO was, assassinated and is kind of dancing on the edge there. But he's putting out a bunch of things that he's setting up. I think he almost described it as like an InfoWar war room, right? Without noticing the connotations where it's all about, like the mainstream media is old, it can't break news. So it's like it's a Constantine playbook. And Taylor is doing that on her Substack as well. And like, it's for me, every time I read it, I feel like I feel cringe. Like I'm like, internally like, oh, don't say that you're the savior of like journalism. Don't say, nobody else has the power to fight back against the system, but they get rewarded for doing that.
It's such a pose, isn't it? I know 2 people who have Substacks that do genuinely brilliant investigative journalism. One of them is Jim Waterson, who used to be at BuzzFeed and then The Guardian. He runs a site called London Centric, and every week he has a really great splash, like an undercover investigation. One of them is into the fact, like, why are there all these sort of weird wizard-themed shops? This is this week's one in the centre of London, and it turns out they're all registered to some random woman who lives in, outskirts of Oxford who doesn't even seem to know that she's on the paperwork for them, right? So there's some, let's be honest, probably some fishy tax business going on there. But, and then there's a guy called Jason Garcia who does Seeking Rents, which does a similar thing of like public service journalism in Florida, who I talked to when I wrote my piece about Ron DeSantis. But they're just actually doing investigative journalism. What they're not doing is constantly going on and on and on and on about how the mainstream media has failed us. They're actually just doing journalism. And there's a big, I think lots of those people, and this is going to make maybe sound very snotty in the establishment, are doing what I think of as kind of journalism effect wallpaper. Well, actually, what they're doing largely is either writing op-ed columns just independently or hosting chat shows, right? And frankly, I could do with them a bit less of kind of carrying on like your, Anna Politkovskaya or Woodward and Bernstein, when what you're actually doing is having a nice chat with someone who basically agrees with you for half an hour every week or 3 hours.
These are the kinds
every
of
week.
conversations that are going to save our civilization, Helen. I don't know what you're talking about.
Only once Lex Friedman has interviewed both Putin and Zelensky, can the war possibly continue? I think not. It's fine. Like, as I say, some of these people are really good. Theo Von is a really good chat show host. He's very funny. He comes from like weird perspective. He asks genuinely interesting questions that other people wouldn't ask. But like, let's not pretend that it's the same thing as spending hours going through like the Pentagon Papers. It's not. It's two different things. They can both be done extremely well, but they're not the same.
I'm shorting stocks in Lex and Joe as well, because I think, like you said, that Joe is in his post-Empire period, and especially because he went all in on Trump, and when the Trump administration is in, it's not going to be a fun time, and it's hard to position yourself as the counterculture to the, the
Trump was unpopular last time. When he left office, he was really unpopular, and luckily for him, it took 4 years and everybody forgot about it. But yeah, it's going to be very hard. And I think the thing that's going to get really unpleasant is all of those people who aren't really prepared to knuckle down and do a day's work. The people that he's brought into the administration from like Fox News or from podcasts or whatever it might be, are going to not, I would say, when they fail, it's going to be pretty ugly, because they're going to have to find somebody. They're going to have to find the deep state or the enemy within, whoever it might be, right? It will never, ever be that they gave it a good crack and it turns out it's harder than it looked from the outside. They just don't have psychologically have that in their toolbox.
And Lex will not solve the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, and will give softball interviews to Putin, and so he'll just continue. But I think it's
right. But Lex's problem was that his interview with Trump was very boring, right? Like, it wasn't outrageous. It was just mediocre.
Yeah,
it wasn't even as fun as Logan Paul deciding to break off halfway through and sell his energy drink, which I really appreciated as a kind of ultimate streamer thing. Or like Adin Ross giving him the customized Cybertruck, right? Lex essentially did a normal broadcast interview of the type you would have got on 60 Minutes or whatever it might be, on a sort of sit down with Brett Bauer, just not as well as those people would have done it, and with more questions about like, how as a CEO, what things you bring to the government, stuff that Trump doesn't have anything interesting to say on, because he's not a deep strategic thinker in that way. So I think that's the problem for Lex, is that he's not outrageous, and if he's not outrageous, what is he? When he was doing 17-hour conversations with tech guys, that was quite interesting. But that market's pretty saturated now, and we feel we've sort of heard from those people. He's got a tough patch ahead. I'd be interested to see how he reinvents himself.
Yeah. So that's a good crop of predictions.
Well, all these predictions are wrong. All these predictions are wrong. You're missing the big picture here. The big picture is Gadsad. Gadsad is to the moon. He's going to be.
You're all in.
2025 is going to be all about Gadsad. Trust me.
Hi, everybody. It's been a while since I've last headed under the desk.
Part of me is looking forward to the inevitable Elon Musk, Donald Trump fallout. I think that's the thing that everybody who's feeling quite miserable about the prospects of American governance is like, well, at least that's going to be funny.
Yeah.